Hi, I'm Laura Flanders. Well, 50 years will be more than sufficient to witness the worst impacts of climate change, according to a major scientific report released in October from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It is obviously a class issue. Poor and working class communities are hit doubly hard by disasters like Hurricane Sandy, as we've seen. But while trade unions that vocally back projects like the Keystone Pipeline and fracking in the Marcellus Shale are in a minority, big labor is not exactly in the leadership of the climate justice movement. And this year's AFL-CIO convention saw no really significant change on that front. So what's going on? Here to talk about that is Sean Sweeney. He works with Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, and he's the director of the Global Labor Institute, a program of the Cornell School of Industrial and Labor Relations. How would you characterize the situation? That's the language of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. How would you characterize the situation that we're in right now, vis-a-vis the changes we're looking at in our lifetime?
Well, it's a planetary emergency. Let's be absolutely clear about it. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, is quite a conservative body. It doesn't want to alarm people. It pulls together the evidence based on 2,500 scientific studies or 2,500 scientists contributing. And it tries to come to, and when you've got that many scientists debating issues, it tends to gravitate towards the more conservative conclusions, to be on the safe side. Yeah. The problem is the IPCC, since it started 20 plus years ago, has always been behind the actual data. So the Arctic melt and the Greenland ice sheet deterioration and the glacier melts, all of that is going much faster than they originally projected. So I think there's an element of conservatism in this. I'm much more responsive to James Hansen's message that if we get Sandy, if we get Katrina, if we get the monsoons we've been seeing and the droughts and the forest fires we've been seeing with less than 1 degree Celsius of global warming, what's 4 degrees, 5 degrees, 6 degrees going to look like? And if business as usual is allowed to continue with the fossil fuel companies burning carbon, selling coal, oil and gas around the world, that's what we're looking at, 6 degrees Celsius of global warming within the lifetime of children born today. That is a horrendous scenario. And we really need to start with the truth. People say to me, unions say to me, well, that's not a very uplifting message. Can you jazz it up a little bit? I wish we had a more uplifting message. We have to tell the truth, that this is a planetary emergency, that the transition being proposed by the corporations and the politicians isn't happening, and we need democratic control over energy, resources, and options. And I think that's a narrative that we should be pushing forward.
And where do unions come in on that?
It's the only way for them. The renewable energy companies don't want to do it union because they're competing against fossil fuels. So the fossil fuel companies that do have unions say, you see, those guys don't want you in their industries.
And that's where we get those arguments about it's either the job or the environment.
But what we're seeing is the privatization of energy, the liberalization of energy markets has opened up profiteering and asset stripping, underinvestment all across the world. That's got to stop. So reclaiming what was once public and turning it into a public service again is a step that unions can support from the point of view of their own members' interests, but also from the perspective of planning a transition to a renewables-based economy. That can be done. It's technically possible. We need to make sure it's politically done. It's very difficult. I mean, first of all, the green economy was touted as a 5 million job builder. Many unions embraced the green economy, anticipating that it would be done right, that it would be done to scale, and there would be common sense in the sense that unions would be given an opportunity to represent the workers in those industries and so on. What we see is the market-based approaches of politics at the moment, coupled with the renewable energy companies who often are hostile to unions. We don't have exactly an open door policy for unions in the renewables or the green economy generally.
So when a coal mine closes and union miners get put out of work, and then the solar panel company that starts is anti-union, it kind of plays right into the right wing's hand.
Where's the exit ramp for the workers in those industries? They may not go into renewable energy, that's fine, but they've got to go somewhere. And when a coal-fired power station is the only job in town, you bet there's going to be resistance. So it's a policy failure. It's not the failure of the unions per se. There could be criticisms made, of course, and I'd be the first one to make them probably, but there is real structural and policy-based questions that need to be addressed.
Was any progress made at the AFL-CIO convention? They made a lot of resolutions on a lot of topics, even including mass incarceration, immigration, so forth. Not so much on climate.
A lot of progress on those issues, yes, and I think that bodes well for the future, even on climate. What's complicated, there are some unions in the Federation, the AFL-CIO, who really are playing, have a close alliance with the industry, to be honest. There's an official alliance between the American Petroleum Institute and the building and construction trades, for example. And this is, again, speaks to, in many ways, a policy failure. If the companies come along to unions and say, we have some big construction projects building fossil fuel infrastructure, and we're prepared to do that union, but we need your help to get these projects approved. Again, it's very difficult for a union leader to say, well, no, we don't think that's good for the environment when there's high unemployment in the industries.
I did talk to the president of the steelworkers, and he admitted, you know, well, it was a tough fight they were in around the Keystone Pipeline, where the steelworkers and the buildings trades, for the most part, supported the pipeline. But he said his goal is to get behind a green economy. His goal is to get the membership to go along. What are you seeing working?
Well, first of all, there's the challenges to reconcile the short-term demands of the moment with the long-term goal. And if it's always going to be a long-term goal, and without actually taking some risks and making some real changes, then that's going to be always going to be a problem. With Keystone, the issue, I think, is the alliance between the industry and some of the unions, which came out of a failure of the Obama administration to really gear up the green economy. A lot of those unions supported Obama's green investments, but they kind of fizzled out, and they're not going forward in the way that they need to be going if we're going to be addressing the climate crisis. So the challenge, again, for unions in around those industries is to articulate some really bold policy initiatives. On Keystone, for example, the unions who supported it would have been far better off if they'd opposed the pipeline and joined with the environmental and climate justice activists and surrounded the White House. Instead of having 10,000 people surrounding the White House, the unions had the capacity to put 100,000 people surrounding the White House. And then you bet some of those infrastructure investments that the unions want, repairing gas pipelines that are ruptured, of building new, robust, resilient infrastructure, they had a much better chance of getting those projects approved, which would generate a lot more jobs and be good for the environment. So this is something that Tony Mazzocchi, deceased now, with the oil, chemical, and atomic workers, articulated, decades ago, and I think that holds true today.
We know all the bad news. What's the most exciting thing that you're seeing out there right now on this front?
First of all, there's a reality check going on globally. The green economy that was promised by organizations like the United Nations Environment Programme, which was largely about stimulating private investment, of appealing to private corporations, is stalled. It's not happening. So there is a recognition that where it is happening, in Germany, Denmark, one or two other countries, it's being driven by the public sector, which means that the prospects of creating stable, decent jobs are higher when it's taken away from simple profit-making equations and environmental protection and the green economy is seen as a public service, and that's going to be a very important conceptual shift that has to happen.
Although in this country we're busily shrinking the public sector on every front.
Well, that's why the United States, unfortunately, is lagging behind the world, or many countries in the world, in making the kind of transitions that are necessary. In Germany now, there are 700 renewable energy cooperatives. Up to 25% of its power generation is in renewables. It's installed as much solar energy last year as the entire installed capacity of solar in the United States. So this is very, very popular in Germany. The recent election showed that there was no real challenge to this agenda. It makes absolute sense environmentally, socially, and economically. So
Naomi Klein writes about climate shock, and she says if the right thinks that climate change and environmentalism is a kind of front for socialism, let's make it so. There's never been a greater opportunity to make an argument for central planning, for example.
Exactly.
In the sense that none of this can be done piecemeal. We can't do it from the bottom up, in fact.
That's right. And you don't have to be a socialist to reach that conclusion. Many conservative scientists, for example, who are not necessarily inclined towards politics, have reached the conclusion that it's technically possible to be zero carbon by 2040, 2050, that we could really make a dent in our emissions and reduce them to the levels that can at least give us a chance, a fighting chance of stabilizing the climate. But they know that private markets are not going to be able to deliver that. They have to see a return on investment within a very short time frame, or they want guarantees for profits over the longer term. And if we have to make those guarantees, why can't we do it in the public sphere and do it in a planned, coordinated, and equitable way? I think that's the way to go.
All right, so grow the public sphere, grow the sense of urgency, but we've talked about the class quality of these crises, and we've covered over and over again how indeed it's poor and working class people's communities who are worst affected. Where are the labor unions in advancing this agenda and claiming it as their own? Talk a bit about the coalition you're working with, the groups you're working with internationally.
I think there's a sense that in order to, and I'll tell you a little World War II anecdote. You know, when my dad was in the Battle of Dunkirk and they were running away from the German panzer divisions, there was a complete chaotic retreat. And during that time, British intelligence was planning the invasion of Europe. Now, if someone had said at that time, why are you planning the invasion of Europe when we're in catastrophic and chaotic retreat, they would probably say, because it's not going to be like this forever. And I think that's the approach we need, that for unions to get away from playing defense and playing offense, they first of all have to tell the truth, they have to be aware of the urgency and seize the opportunities. And that means appealing, not just speaking to all workers and all people, but also to extending that solidarity to the biosphere and the ecosystems itself.
What do you mean?
Well, why should, if we're talking about life holistically as a total thing, that we are part of the environment, then the environment is part of us, then why does solidarity stop in the human form? Why should we be anthropocentric about it? We need to be totally earth-centered in our approach. Naomi Klein has nailed that question. And it may sound tree hugging, but what's wrong with hugging a tree?
So all for one and all for one planet.
Absolutely. I mean, and you know, a lot of working people who are struggling to make ends meet get that. They understand that they are being abused in the same way as the environment is being abused. That the kind of economic system we live under now, which exploits them, is also having the same approach to the planet itself. So people are aware of it. We just have to build a political strategy around it and not be afraid.
Do you think the union leadership is afraid? I'm thinking of the head of the AFL-CIO or the head of the SEIU. Are they afraid of this?
I think they have challenges within their own organizations. There are workers who don't get it, workers who listen to the propaganda of talk radio and the right wing and the Tea Party. Definitely, we got to be aware of that. But there are certainly a generation, I think a newer generation of union leaders who are beginning to get it and embracing it.
Do you have an example?
Well, I think people involved with the excluded workers, the domestic workers. I think workers who represent immigrants who are often refugees of climate change. That's a fact that's not usually recognized as deeply as it is. I think they understand it. I think women are more aware of it, frankly, than men in the trade union movement. That's my anecdotal experience. I can't,
add it to the list.
I add it to the list. And I think globally, there are the unions that are asking the right questions and challenging austerity and building movements. They are the ones who are getting it, and you can see that in Brazil, Argentina, South Africa, and even parts of Europe as well, and North America too. So there are Canadian unions, the new union Unifor, which was the merger of the Canadian Auto Workers and the Communication, Energy and Paper Workers, have put climate protection, environmental sustainability in their constitution. You don't see many unions doing that. So there's some encouraging signs that there's a shift in thinking. It just has to happen a lot faster, which is why we're doing the work we're doing to try to make sure that we pull those thinkers together and build a strategy around it.
Great. Sean Sweeney, thanks so much for
Thank
joining
you,
us.
Laura. Thanks. It was really great. Thank you.